You know, I've always considered myself a pretty reasonable guy. Live and let live, that's my motto. I bought my condo in the Willow Creek complex about 10 years ago looking for a bit of peace and quiet, a place where I could tinker with my projects. I'm a retired mechanical engineer, you see, and old habits die hard. For the most part, Willow Creek delivered. The neighbors were decent, the grounds were kept well enough, and the homeowners association, well, they were mostly just a line item on my monthly dues statement. Sure, there were the occasional newsletters about lawn maintenance schedules or reminders about parking in designated spots, the usual low-level hum of communal living. I'd read them, shrug, and get on with my life. I paid my dues on time, kept my small patio tidy, and generally tried to be the kind of resident who fades into the background, causing no trouble for anyone. Little did I know that this carefully cultivated anonymity was about to be spectacularly, and I mean spectacularly, shattered by the very entity that was supposed to ensure our collective tranquility. It all started, as these things often do, with something small, something that seemed almost trivial at the time, but it planted a seed of unease. There was a new HOA president elected, a woman named Brenda Mulroney. I'd seen her around, of course. She had that air about her, you know the type? Perfectly coiffed hair that looked like it could withstand a hurricane, a perpetually pursed lip expression as if constantly smelling something unpleasant, and a way of looking at you over the top of her glasses that made you feel like you were a particularly disappointing science experiment. Her first few newsletters had a distinctly different tone, less informative, more prescriptive. More rules seemed to be clarified, invented, and there was an undercurrent of, well, let's call it zealous enthusiasm for enforcement. I remember thinking, here we go, but I figured, how bad could it get? I wasn't hosting wild parties or letting my non-existent dog use the petunias as a fire hydrant. I was, for all intents and purposes, a model resident. Or so I thought. My little slice of suburbia was comfortable. My condo wasn't palatial, but it was mine. I had my workshop set up in the spare bedroom, my books lined the shelves, and my favorite armchair was perfectly molded to my form after years of dedicated service. The most excitement I usually had was when a new schematic I'd been puzzling over finally clicked into place, or when a particularly stubborn bolt finally yielded to my persuasion. The HOA, in my mind, was like the weather, sometimes annoying, mostly ignorable, and ultimately something you just lived with. They had their little fiefdom, their monthly meetings where I imagined they discussed the vital importance of beige conformity, and as long as they left me to my own devices, I was content to let them play their games. This, I would soon learn, was a naive assumption. Brenda, it turned out, wasn't just playing games, she was on a mission, a crusade to mold Willow Creek into her vision of suburban perfection, and anyone who didn't fit that vision, or who simply existed in a way she found inconvenient, was about to become a target. And I, in my blissful ignorance, was about to wander right into her crosshairs, armed with nothing but a quiet life and a deep-seated belief that a man's home is his castle, or at least, his condo with reasonably secure locks. The calm before the storm, as they say, is often the most deceptive. Mine was filled with the pleasant whir of my lathe and the comforting aroma of soldering flux. If only I'd known that the biggest project of my retirement was about to be defending my own front door. It was a Tuesday. I remember that clearly because I'd just come back from my weekly trip to the hardware store, picking up some specialized bearings for a miniature steam engine I was building. I pulled into my parking spot, grabbed my bags, and headed for my front door, whistling a little tune. I reached for my keys, inserted the familiar brass shape into the lock, and nothing. It didn't turn. I jiggled it. Still nothing. Frowning, I tried again, more carefully this time. The key went in, but it met a solid, unyielding resistance. That was odd. My lock had been a bit sticky lately, but this felt different. This felt wrong. I pulled the key out, examined it. No, it was the right key. I looked at the lock itself. It looked newer, shinier. A cold dread started to prickle at the back of my neck. I tried the deadbolt. Same story. My key, the key I'd used 1,000 times, was suddenly useless. My heart started to thump a bit harder. Had I been robbed? But the door was locked. Confusion warred with a rising sense of violation. I knocked, a ridiculously polite little rap, as if expecting myself to answer. Silence. Then I saw it, taped to the door just above the new, alien-looking doorknob. A crisp white envelope with the Willow Creek HOA logo printed in the corner. My stomach clenched. I carefully peeled the tape off, my fingers suddenly feeling clumsy. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a letter addressed to current resident, not even my name. It stated, in cold, bureaucratic language, that due to a recently identified security vulnerability concerning substandard locking mechanisms on several units, the HOA had taken proactive measures to ensure the safety and security of all residents. This proactive measure apparently involved them unilaterally deciding my locks were substandard and replacing them without my knowledge or consent. There was a line about a new key being available for pickup at the HOA office during business hours, and a bill for the emergency locksmith services would be forthcoming. Emergency? What emergency? The only emergency I was experiencing was being locked out of my own damn home. Indignation began to bubble up, hot and fierce. This wasn't just an overreach, this was an invasion. They had no right. I stared at the letter, then at the gleaming new lock that stood as a barrier to my own life. My tools were in there. My research. My cat, Patches, who was probably wondering where his dinner was. That thought galvanized me. Brenda. This had Brenda Mulroney's fingerprints all over it. Her smug, officious, power-tripping fingerprints. I crumpled the notice in my fist, the official-sounding words suddenly feeling like a personal insult. The hardware store bags dropped to the ground beside me. My quiet afternoon was officially over. The game, it seemed, had changed, and I was, quite literally, on the outside looking in. The sheer audacity of it left me momentarily speechless. Who does that? Who breaks into someone's home under the thinnest veil of authority and changes their locks? It felt like something out of a dystopian novel, not a quiet suburban condo complex. The sun was starting to dip lower, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns, and a chill was settling in the air, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the realization that my sanctuary had been breached, not by a burglar, but by the very people who were supposed to be looking out for our collective good. Or rather, by one person who clearly had an agenda. My first instinct, after the initial shock and rage, was to march straight over to the HOA office and demand answers and my key. The office was a small, soulless room in the community clubhouse, usually manned by a part-time administrator who seemed perpetually overwhelmed. But I knew Brenda often held court there in the afternoons. I strode across the common green, the crumpled HOA letter still clutched in my hand like a declaration of war. Sure enough, as I approached, I could see her through the window, perched at the desk like a queen on her throne, tapping away at a laptop. I didn't bother knocking. I pushed the door open with more force than strictly necessary, causing a little bell above it to jingle frantically. Brenda looked up, her expression shifting from bored concentration to mild annoyance, then to a carefully constructed mask of professional concern when she saw my face. "Ah, Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice smooth as oil yet with an underlying edge of steel. "I was wondering when you'd be by," like she'd been expecting a social call, not a man she'd just effectively evicted from his own home. "Brenda," I started, trying to keep my voice level, but the anger was a living thing inside me. "What in God's name do you think you're doing? You changed my locks." She blinked slowly, as if I were being unnecessarily dramatic. "We sent a notice, Mr. Henderson. It was a necessary security upgrade. Several units were identified as having deficient hardware." Deficient? My lock was a standard, perfectly functional deadbolt. It had kept me secure for a decade. Deficient according to whom, Brenda? And since when do you have the right to enter my home without my permission and alter my property? I slammed the crumpled letter down on her desk. Her eyes flicked to it, then back to me, her lips thinning. "It's all in the bylaws, Mr. Henderson. Section 7, subsection B, paragraph 3, the association reserves the right to enter any unit in case of emergency or to perform necessary maintenance or repairs to protect common elements or other units, or to abate any violation of the declaration or bylaws after due notice, except in an emergency where no notice is required." She recited it like a mantra, a shield of bureaucratic nonsense. "What emergency, Brenda?" I demanded. Was my old lock about to spontaneously combust and threaten the common elements? This is an outrageous abuse of power. She actually had the gall to look slightly smug. The emergency was the potential for break-ins due to substandard locks. "We have a responsibility to all residents. Your old lock was deemed a risk. Deemed by whom?" "By you." I pressed. "You're not a locksmith, Brenda. You're not a security expert. You're an HOA president on a power trip." Her composure flickered for a moment. A faint flush rose on her cheeks. "I will not be spoken to in that tone, Mr. Henderson. The decision was made by the board for the safety of the community, the whole board." I asked, skeptical. I knew a couple of the other board members. They seemed like reasonable people, not the type to approve something this drastic without a very good reason. Brenda waved a dismissive hand. It was an executive decision based on urgent need. Now, if you'll calm down, I have your new key right here. She rummaged in a drawer and produced a small manila envelope. There will, of course, be a charge for the locksmith and the new hardware, which will be added to your next HOA statement. I stared at her, speechless for a moment at the sheer, unadulterated audacity. She locks me out of my house and now she wants me to pay for it? You can't be serious, I finally managed. Oh, I am perfectly serious, Mr. Henderson. The bylaws are very clear on owner responsibility for costs incurred by the association to rectify violations or ensure safety. I snatched the envelope from her. This isn't over, Brenda, I said, my voice low and determined. Not by a long shot. She gave me a tight, unpleasant smile. I wouldn't expect it to be, Mr. Henderson. Some people just don't appreciate when others are trying to help them. Help me? She'd helped herself to my privacy, my security, and my peace of mind. I turned and walked out, the little bell jangling mockingly behind me. Back at my condo, the new key thankfully worked. I let myself in, Patches twining around my ankles, meowing his concern and hunger. The condo felt different, violated. The new lock on the inside looked just as alien as it had from the outside. I changed, fed the cat, and then sat down at my computer, my mind racing. Brenda had thrown down the gauntlet wrapped in the flimsy justification of the bylaws. Well, if it was a war of bylaws she wanted, then a war of bylaws she would get. But I had a feeling this would go far beyond just quoting obscure clauses at each other. This was personal. The next few days were a blur of simmering anger and meticulous research. I downloaded every version of the Willow Creek HOA declaration, bylaws, and rules and regulations I could find on their clunky website. I went through them line by line, highlighter in hand, looking for anything that could justify Brenda's actions or, more importantly, anything that could prove she'd overstepped. And oh boy, did she overstep. While Section 7, Subsection B, Paragraph 3 did indeed exist, it was clearly intended for genuine emergencies, a burst pipe flooding the unit below, a fire, that sort of thing. There was no provision for preemptive, non-consensual lock changes based on one person's arbitrary assessment of substandard hardware. Furthermore, the definition of due notice was conveniently ignored. A note taped to my door after the fact hardly constituted due notice. I also started talking to my neighbors discreetly at first. Had anyone else had their locks changed? No, it seemed I was the lucky recipient of Brenda's special attention. Why me? I could only speculate. Maybe she'd seen me bringing in some of my engineering equipment and decided I was running some sort of clandestine, rule-breaking operation. Maybe she just didn't like the cut of my jib. With people like Brenda, it was often impossible to discern any rational motivation. The more I dug, the angrier I got. It turned out Brenda had a history of this kind of behavior, albeit on a smaller scale. Fining people for having the wrong shade of patio umbrella, sending threatening letters about flower pots that were 2 inches too tall. She was a petty tyrant, drunk on the thimbleful of power her HOA position afforded her. My lock change was just her boldest move yet. I drafted a formal letter of complaint to the HOA board outlining Brenda's overreach, the violation of my privacy, and the unauthorized expenditure of HOA funds if indeed she was planning to use them for her security initiative. Beyond just billing me, I cited the relevant bylaws she had ignored or misinterpreted and demanded a formal apology, a full reimbursement for the lock change, which I had no intention of paying, and an assurance that this would not happen again to any resident. I sent it via certified mail, return receipt requested. Predictably, the response was a masterpiece of bureaucratic stonewalling, almost certainly dictated by Brenda herself, though signed by the board secretary. It essentially reiterated their stance, claimed their actions were justified, and politely told me to pound sand. They even had the nerve to include a separate invoice for $250 for the emergency lock replacement service. The audacity was breathtaking. But the HOA wasn't done. Oh no. Brenda, clearly emboldened by my initial, purely procedural, resistance, decided to escalate. A week later, I received another official-looking envelope. This time, it was a violation notice. Apparently, my front door, the very door they had just put a new lock on, was now in violation of aesthetic standards. The notice vaguely mentioned unapproved hardware modifications and deviation from community standard appearance. It was referring to the new lock they had installed. The sheer, unadulterated stupidity of it would have been comical if it wasn't so infuriating. They were fining me for the lock they forced upon me. I was starting to feel like I was living in some kind of Kafkaesque nightmare. Then came another notice. The small, weatherproof box housing my doorbell was apparently not of an approved color. It had been the same color for 10 years. I was getting fined $50 for that. Then, a warning about the small, decorative wind chime my late wife had loved, which had hung by my patio for years without a whisper of complaint. Suddenly, it was a noise nuisance and a violation of some obscure rule about exterior attachments. Each notice was a fresh jab, a deliberate provocation. Brenda wasn't just trying to assert her authority, she was trying to break me, to make my life so miserable with petty harassments that I'd either give in, shut up, or move out. Little did she know she was poking a bear. A very methodical, very patient, and now very, very motivated bear. My engineering mind, usually occupied with gears and circuits, began to turn to a different kind of problem. How to deal with an out-of-control HOA president who clearly believed she was above the rules she so zealously enforced on others. I knew fighting Brenda on her own turf, playing by her twisted interpretation of the rules, was a fool's errand. She could invent new violations faster than I could contest them. Appealing to the board was useless as long as she controlled it or cowed them into submission. I needed something different. Something that would not only solve my immediate problem, the constant fear of further invasions of my privacy and property, but would also send an undeniable message. A message that said, "You've pushed too far. This stops now." I spent a few sleepless nights staring at my ceiling, Patches purring contentedly beside me, oblivious to the storm brewing in his human's mind. I replayed Brenda's smug face, her dismissive tone, the utter contempt she had for my rights. And then it hit me. It was one of those middle-of-the-night epiphanies, the kind that makes you sit bolt upright in bed. If she was so concerned about the security of my door, so obsessed with its hardware, then I would give her a door that was so secure, so unassailably robust, that she wouldn't dare touch it. I would give her something that screamed, "This is my domain." Keep out. The idea, at first, seemed ludicrous, almost comical in its audacity. But the more I thought about it, the more perfect it became. I would replace my standard, flimsy condo front door with something unconventional. Something that would make her aesthetic violations and her concerns about substandard hardware look utterly ridiculous. I decided I was going to install a bank vault door. Yes, you read that right. A genuine, honest-to-God, steel-reinforced, multi-ton bank vault door. The image of Brenda's face when she first saw it was enough to make me chuckle in the darkness. The beauty of it was manifold. Firstly, it was the ultimate statement in security. No one could argue it was substandard. Secondly, it was so far outside the realm of normal HOA disputes that it would completely wrongfoot her. What bylaw could possibly cover the installation of a bank vault door on a residential condo? Thirdly, and perhaps most deliciously, it was a problem of my own making on my own property that I would then dare her to fix. My engineering background suddenly felt like a superpower. I knew about stress tolerances, load-bearing structures, reinforcement, and precision installation. While a full-sized bank vault door weighing several tons might be overkill and structurally problematic for a condo building, a smaller, reinforced steel security door, perhaps a decommissioned safe deposit room door or a custom-built vault-style door, was definitely feasible. It would still have the visual and psychological impact I was aiming for. The first step was research. I dove into the internet, not looking for HOA bylaws this time, but for suppliers of high-security doors, salvage companies, and custom metal fabricators. I learned about different classes of vault doors, locking mechanisms, steel gauges, and installation requirements. I also, crucially, reread the HOA architectural guidelines. They were incredibly specific about window treatments, paint colors for exterior walls, which my door was part of, and even the types of plants allowed in patio gardens. But about the type of front door? Beyond specifying it had to be maintained in good repair and harmonious with the overall aesthetic of the community, a delightfully vague and subjective phrase, there was surprisingly little. No mention of materials, thickness, or specific locking mechanisms beyond needing to be secure. Oh, this was going to be good. I could argue that a vault door was the pinnacle of good repair and security. And as for harmonious, well, that was in the eye of the beholder, wasn't it? And my beholding, I found it to be a thing of beauty and a symbol of glorious defiance. The seed of an idea had not just sprouted. It had taken root and was already growing into a mighty oak of righteous indignation and creative problem-solving. Brenda Mulroney wanted a war over my front door. She was about to get one she could never have anticipated. The planning phase was where my engineering brain truly kicked into high gear. This wasn't just about making a statement, it was about making a flawless statement. The door had to be not only impressive but also impeccably installed and, as far as possible, compliant with any actual, relevant building codes which were distinct from Brenda's whimsical HOA rules. I found a company a few states over that specialized in custom security doors and also dealt in refurbished bank equipment. After a few phone calls and emails exchanging specifications and discussing options, I settled on a design. It wouldn't be a 10-ton behemoth that would crack the building's foundation, but it would be a Class 5 vault door, typically used for bank branches or jeweler's safes. It featured half-inch thick solid steel plate, multiple hardened steel locking bolts that extended deep into a reinforced steel frame, a dual locking mechanism, a combination lock, and a high-security key lock, and a formidable, multi-spoked chrome handle. It would weigh around 800 pounds, heavy but manageable with the right equipment and reinforcement of the door frame. The finish would be a brushed stainless steel, which I reasoned could be argued as harmonious with the modern, if somewhat bland, aesthetic of Willow Creek. It certainly wasn't beige, but it wasn't garish either. It was substantial. The next step was the frame. A door like that couldn't just be hung on a standard wooden door frame. I designed a custom steel subframe that would be bolted directly into the structural supports around the doorway, distributing the weight and providing an immovable anchor for the door's locking bolts. This was the trickiest part, as I needed to ensure it was structurally sound without making unauthorized alterations to common elements beyond the immediate doorway. I consulted with a structural engineer friend of mine under the guise of a hypothetical security upgrade project, just to be sure my calculations were sound. He raised an eyebrow at the specs but confirmed my approach was viable. Then came the logistics. Getting an 800-pound door and a heavy steel frame delivered and installed without attracting too much premature attention from Brenda's network of curtain-twitching informants was going to be a challenge. I decided to schedule the delivery and installation for a weekday morning when most people would be at work. I hired a small, discreet team of riggers and a specialist welder/fabricator I knew from my professional days, guys who were used to handling heavy, sensitive equipment and valued discretion. I paid them well, with a bonus for speed and silence. While all this was happening, I continued to play the game with the HOA, albeit with a newfound sense of amusement. I paid the fine for the unapproved doorbell color under protest, enclosing a letter that pointed out the color hadn't changed in a decade and asked for the approved color swatch, which they naturally couldn't provide. I took down my late wife's wind chime, but not before sending a polite inquiry asking for decibel level readings, proving it was a nuisance. Each interaction was meticulously documented, building my own file of the HOA's unreasonable behavior. Brenda, meanwhile, seemed to be reveling in her perceived victory. I'd see her around the complex, and she'd give me that tight, knowing little smile, as if I were a naughty schoolboy she was successfully bringing to heel. If only she knew what was coming. The beauty of the vault door plan was its sheer, unassailable logic from a security standpoint. In a world of flimsy residential doors, this was Fort Knox. Any argument she could make about it being non-compliant would have to dance around the fact that it was exponentially more secure than any other door in the complex, including the one she had forced on me. I even found a clause in the HOA architectural guidelines that stated security improvements, such as upgraded locks or reinforced doors, are encouraged, provided they do not negatively impact the structural integrity of the building or the aesthetic harmony of the community. The vault door was certainly an upgraded lock and a reinforced door. Structural integrity was covered by my reinforced frame design. Aesthetic harmony? Well, that was beautifully subjective, wasn't it? My definition of harmony was about to get a very public airing. The final piece of the puzzle was timing. I wanted the installation to be a surprise, a fait accompli. The less warning Brenda had, the better. I waited for a week when I knew she was particularly busy with some HOA landscaping project she was micromanaging, hoping her attention would be diverted. The day was set. The pieces were in place. All that was left was the execution. The day of the installation arrived cloaked in an early morning mist, which suited my purposes perfectly. The delivery truck, an unmarked panel van, rumbled quietly to a halt in my designated parking spot just as dawn was breaking. My team, two burly riggers named Mac and Gus and a wiry, intense welder named Sal, were models of efficiency. They moved with a practiced, almost silent synchronicity that was a joy to watch. The old door, Brenda's monument to petty tyranny, was off its hinges and leaning against the wall within minutes. Then came the delicate operation of removing the existing wooden door frame without causing undue damage to the surrounding drywall. Sal, with his precise cutting tools, made short work of it, exposing the building's structural studs. Next, the custom-made steel subframe was brought in. This was the crucial part. It had to be perfectly level and square and securely bolted to the studs. Mac and Gus manhandled it into place, while Sal and I checked the alignment with lasers and levels. The rhythmic whir of high-torque drills biting into wood and metal was the only significant sound, and even that was surprisingly muted. We'd put up heavy blankets on the inside of the condo to dampen noise and contain dust. The frame went in like a glove, a testament to careful measurement and design. Then came the main event, the door itself. It was wheeled from the van on a heavy-duty dolly, shrouded in protective coverings. Even wrapped up, it had an undeniable presence, a sense of latent power. Maneuvering 800 pounds of steel through a standard condo hallway and into position was no mean feat, but Mac and Gus were pros. With grunts of exertion and whispered commands, they guided it towards the new steel frame. The heavy-duty hinges designed to carry far more weight were aligned and the massive hinge pins slotted home. There was a satisfying thud as the door settled onto its mountings. Sal then got to work welding the final anchor points and ensuring everything was rock solid. While he was finishing up, Mac and Gus meticulously cleaned the area, leaving no trace of their work except for the gleaming new portal that now guarded my home. Finally, the moment of truth. I stepped forward, reached for the large, spoked chrome handle, and gave it a turn. The internal mechanisms engaged with a series of deeply satisfying clicks and clunks, like the workings of a giant, intricate clock. I pulled, and the massive steel slab swung inward with surprising smoothness, balanced perfectly on its hinges. Stepping inside, I turned and pushed it closed. Another series of clunks as the multiple locking bolts shot home, seating themselves deep within the steel frame. I spun the combination dial, heard the tumblers fall into place, and then, for good measure, engaged the high-security key lock. Silence. A profound, impenetrable silence. It was magnificent. It was absurd. It was perfect. The entire operation, from the removal of the old door to the final locking of the new one, had taken just under 4 hours. By 9 a.m., the team was gone, the hallway was clear, and my condo was secured by what was, without a doubt, the most formidable front door in Willow Creek, possibly in the entire state for a residential unit. I made myself a cup of coffee, my hands still trembling slightly with adrenaline and a giddy sense of triumph. I sat in my armchair, patches rubbing against the gleaming steel, and just admired it. It wasn't just a door, it was a statement. A declaration of independence. Now, all I had to do was wait for Brenda to see it. I didn't imagine I'd have to wait long. The grapevine in Willow Creek was notoriously efficient, especially when it came to anything out of the ordinary. I almost felt a twinge of sympathy for the first unsuspecting neighbor who would round the corner and come face to face with my new entryway. Almost. The first indication that my handiwork had been discovered came not from Brenda directly but from a series of hushed, urgent phone calls I overheard snippets of from my open window later that afternoon. My unit was at the end of a short corridor, slightly set back, so it wasn't immediately visible from the main walkway. But sooner or later, someone was bound to notice. Around 3 p.m., I heard a distinct gasp from the hallway followed by retreating footsteps and frantic whispering. A little smile played on my lips. The ripple effect had begun. I busied myself with some minor adjustments to the door's internal mechanism, just some fine-tuning of the tension on the bolt release, when I heard a more determined set of footsteps approaching. These weren't hesitant or surprised, these were angry, purposeful. I recognized that cadence. It was Brenda. I quickly secured the interlocking mechanism and waited. A sharp, insistent rapping echoed through the steel. It sounded faintly ridiculous, like a woodpecker attacking a battleship. I let her rap for a good 30 seconds before I even moved. Then, I calmly walked to the door, took a deep breath, and peered through the specially installed, wide-angle, reinforced peephole I'd insisted on. Yep, it was Brenda, all right. Her face was a fascinating kaleidoscope of emotions, shock, disbelief, and a rapidly escalating shade of puce that clashed rather spectacularly with her sensible beige blazer. Flanking her were 2 other board members, a nervous-looking fellow named Arthur and a woman, Carol, who usually seemed more reasonable but now looked thoroughly bewildered. Mr. Henderson. Brenda's voice was muffled but still carried the unmistakable tones of outrage. Open this thing immediately. I decided to employ the Socratic method. Is there a problem, Ms. Mulroney? I called back, my voice calm and clear. Problem? Problem? You've installed, what in God's name is that? That is not an approved door. That is a monstrosity. Actually, Ms. Mulroney, I replied, enjoying this perhaps a little too much, it's a Class 5 rated security door. Half-inch steel plate, reinforced frame, dual locking mechanisms. I was concerned about the substandard hardware issues you previously raised, so I took proactive measures to ensure my unit is exceptionally secure. You know, for the safety of the community and all, I could almost hear her grinding her teeth. This is a flagrant violation of architectural standards, Mr. Henderson. It's completely out of character with the community. Ah, you must be referring to the harmonious aesthetic clause, I said thoughtfully. Well, I find brushed stainless steel to be quite harmonious. And surely, ultimate security is a desirable characteristic for any door in our community, wouldn't you agree? Especially given your previous concerns, Arthur, the nervous board member, chimed in, his voice quavering slightly. But it looks like a bank vault, Mr. Henderson. A very apt observation, Arthur, I conceded. It is, in fact, a vault-style door. Extremely resistant to unauthorized entry. I can sleep soundly now, knowing I'm safe from any potential vulnerabilities. There was a sputtering sound from Brenda's side of the door. You can't do this. This is unheard of. We will have this removed, Mr. Henderson. We will fine you into oblivion. On what grounds, precisely, Ms. Mulroney? I asked, genuinely curious to hear her attempt at a justification. Are you saying you prefer doors that are less secure? As for fines, you'll need to cite the specific bylaw I violated by installing a door that far exceeds any conceivable security standard. I've reviewed the architectural guidelines quite thoroughly. They encourage security upgrades. This is, by any definition, a significant security upgrade. Carol, the other board member, finally spoke, her voice more measured than Brenda's. Mr. Henderson, surely you can see this is unusual. It's going to cause a lot of concern among the residents. Concern about what, Carol? I asked. That their neighbor is too secure? That my door might be too difficult for, say, an unauthorized person with a key to a master lock to open without consent. I let that hang in the air for a moment, a pointed reference to their previous actions. Brenda exploded. This is an affront. An insult. You are deliberately flouting the rules and making a mockery of this association. I demand you begin removal procedures immediately. Demand? I chuckled softly. Ms. Mulroney, with all due respect, you are standing on the other side of half an inch of solid steel and multiple locking bolts. I'm not entirely sure you're in a position to demand anything. Perhaps a polite request, accompanied by a specific, legally sound citation of a bylaw violation, might be a more productive approach. The silence on the other side of the door was thick with unspoken fury. I could picture Brenda, fists clenched, her face probably nearing purple. You will be hearing from our lawyers, Mr. Henderson, she finally shrieked. You will regret this. I look forward to a reasoned discussion with legal counsel, I replied pleasantly. In the meantime, I trust my door meets your stringent security requirements. Have a lovely afternoon, and with that, I stepped away from the peephole, leaving them to fume in the hallway. The first battle had been joined, and I had a distinct feeling that my new door was already earning its keep. The sheer, unadulterated rage in Brenda's voice was music to my ears, a symphony of thwarted tyranny. True to Brenda's shrieked promise, a letter from the HOA's legal counsel arrived a few days later. It was everything I expected, pompous, filled with vaguely threatening legal jargon, and utterly devoid of any specific, actionable bylaw violation regarding the door itself. It spoke of failure to adhere to community aesthetic standards, unauthorized structural modifications, which was false, as my steel subframe was contained within my unit's immediate doorway and designed not to impact shared structures, and conduct detrimental to the peaceful enjoyment of the community. It demanded the immediate removal of the offending installation and threatened further legal action, including seeking a court injunction and levying substantial daily fines if I failed to comply within 7 days. I read it over several times, a grim smile on my face. They were trying to bully me with big words and the implied threat of costly litigation. What they didn't count on was that I, too, could play the legal game. And I had something they didn't, the undeniable truth that my door, while perhaps unconventional, was a direct response to their own prior overreach, and that it was, in essence, a superior piece of security equipment. I consulted with a lawyer friend of mine, old Tom Finnegan, who had a reputation for being a bit of a shark when it came to civil disputes and particularly relished cases against overzealous bureaucracies. I laid out the whole saga for him, from the initial lock change by the HOA to my installation of the vault door, providing him with copies of all correspondence, the bylaws, and photos of Brenda's approved lock versus my new door. Tom listened intently, a twinkle in his eye growing brighter with every detail. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and roared with laughter. "Alex, my boy," he said, wiping a tear from his eye, "this is magnificent. It's the most creative bit of preemptive litigation avoidance I've seen in years. They changed your locks, so you built Fort Knox. Poetic. So, you think I have a case? I asked. Case? Tom snorted. They barely have a leg to stand on. Aesthetic standards are notoriously subjective and difficult to enforce unless they are crystal clear and uniformly applied. And given their prior actions, their claim of peaceful enjoyment being disrupted by your secure door is laughable. We can argue estoppel. They created the situation by messing with your locks in the first place, leading you to seek a definitive security solution. Plus, the onus is on them to prove your door violates a specific enforceable rule. Not just their delicate sensibilities. He then pointed out something I hadn't fully capitalized on yet. And this new door of yours, it's entirely on your property, affecting your entryway, right? Unless the bylaws explicitly dictate the exact material, design, and weight of every single front door down to the last screw, which I highly doubt. Their blowing smoke Tom helped me draft a response to the HOA's lawyers. It was a masterpiece of polite, firm, legal counterpunching. We acknowledged their letter, reiterated that the installation was a security upgrade made necessary by the HOA's prior unauthorized actions, and firmly stated that the door complied with all relevant building codes and did not violate any specific and enforceable provisions of the HOA governing documents. We pointed out the vagueness of aesthetic harmony and stated my belief that brushed stainless steel and superior craftsmanship were indeed harmonious. We also gently reminded them of the HOA's own encouragement of security upgrades and questioned why they would object to the most secure upgrade imaginable. Finally, we invited them to specify the exact bylaw with section and paragraph number that my door supposedly violated and to provide evidence of how it negatively impacted structural integrity or posed any actual, demonstrable harm to the community beyond offending Ms. Mulroney's personal taste. We also hinted that any attempt to levy fines or pursue further action without such specific justification would be met with a vigorous defense and a potential counterclaim for harassment and abuse of process. We sent it off, and then the waiting game began again. Meanwhile, word of the vault door guy had spread like wildfire through Willow Creek. My immediate neighbors were mostly amused, some even subtly supportive. I got a few thumbs up from people I barely knew. One older lady, Mrs. Henderson, no relation, ironically, who had her own run-ins with Brenda over her prize-winning roses being too vibrant, actually baked me a pie. Give him hell, dear, she'd whispered when she dropped it off. Brenda, however, was apparently apoplectic. I heard through the grapevine, which was now actively feeding me information it seemed, that she was ranting in HOA meetings about my flagrant disregard for community values and my monstrous barricade, but her power base seemed to be eroding. People were starting to question her judgment and her priorities. Why was she so obsessed with one man's incredibly secure door when there were actual issues, like potholes in the driveway or the leaky roof in the clubhouse, that needed attention? The HOA's lawyers, after receiving our response, went quiet for a bit. I imagined them scratching their heads, realizing this wasn't the easy intimidation case they'd anticipated. The ball was back in their court and they needed a much better serve if they wanted to stay in the game. The anticipated showdown came about 3 weeks later, not in a courtroom, but at the annual HOA general meeting. This was usually a sleepy affair, poorly attended, where the board presented a budget and a few residents might ask a question about lawn care. This year, however, the clubhouse meeting room was packed. Word had gotten out that the vault door issue was going to be discussed, and it seemed half the complex had turned out eager for some drama. I arrived a few minutes early, taking a seat near the back, an island of calm in a sea of curious and expectant faces. Tom Finnegan had advised me to attend, to remain polite, and to let Brenda hang herself with her own rope if she tried to make a public spectacle of it. Brenda and the other board members were seated at a long table at the front, looking distinctly uncomfortable under the increased scrutiny. Brenda, in particular, had a pinched, almost desperate look about her. She opened the meeting with the usual formalities, her voice tighter than usual. When she got to new business, she took a deep, shuddering breath. As many of you are aware, she began, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed rage, we have a resident, Mr. Henderson, who has taken it upon himself to install a highly unorthodox and non-compliant front door on his unit. A murmur went through the crowd. This structure, she continued, gesturing vaguely in my direction, though not making eye contact, is a clear violation of our community's aesthetic standards and architectural guidelines. It is an eyesore, a monstrosity, and it sets a dangerous precedent. She paused for dramatic effect, clearly expecting outrage and support from the assembled residents. Instead, there was a hesitant silence, then someone from the middle of the room, a quiet accountant named Mr. Peterson, spoke up. "Brenda, with all due respect," he said, his voice surprisingly firm, "what specific rule does Mr. Henderson's door violate? I've read the bylaws, and I can't find anything that says you can't have a steel door or a secure 1-inch." Brenda looked flustered. It's about harmony, Mr. Peterson. It doesn't harmonize." Mrs. Henderson, the pie lady, piped up from the front row. "Well, I think it looks rather handsome, Brenda. Very solid. Makes me feel safer knowing there's at least one door in this place a burglar couldn't get through with a toothpick, unlike those flimsy things most of us have." A ripple of amusement and agreement went through the crowd. Brenda's face tightened. This is not a laughing matter. Mr. Henderson was previously cited for having a substandard lock. The HOA took action to rectify that for his own safety. That was my cue. I stood up slowly. "Actually, Ms. Mulroney," I said, my voice calm but carrying easily in the suddenly quiet room. "If I may clarify, the HOA, under your direction, changed my locks without my consent, claiming an emergency that never existed and then tried to bill me for it. When I objected to this invasion of my privacy and property, I was then subjected to a series of petty violation notices for things like my doorbell and a wind chime that had been in place for years. My current door, while admittedly robust, is a direct response to concerns about security and a desire to prevent any further unauthorized access to my home. It is, by any measure, the most secure door in this complex." I paused, then added, "and I'm still waiting for the HOA to cite the specific bylaw that prohibits such a security upgrade as requested by my legal counsel." Brenda was sputtering. Your lawyer. This is an internal HOA matter. You're deliberately trying to undermine the board's authority." Tom, who had quietly slipped into the meeting and was now standing beside me, cleared his throat. "Actually, Ms. Mulroney," he said, his voice exuding calm authority, "when an HOA board oversteps its bounds, threatens legal action, and potentially misuses HOA funds on personal vendettas, it ceases to be a purely internal matter. Mr. Henderson has every right to seek legal counsel to protect his property and his rights. And as for authority, true authority comes from fair and consistent application of clear rules, not from arbitrary dictates." The mood in the room had shifted palpably. People were nodding, whispering amongst themselves. The narrative Brenda had tried to spin, of me as a rogue rulebreaker, was falling apart. She was being exposed as the one who was unreasonable, obsessive. Arthur, the nervous board member, started fidgeting and wouldn't meet Brenda's eye. Carol looked increasingly uncomfortable. Brenda, seeing her support evaporate, made one last, desperate lunge. "This board will not be intimidated. We will proceed with fining Mr. Henderson daily until that thing is removed. And we will take him to court if necessary." At this, Tom smiled, a predatory glint in his eye. "An interesting proposition, Ms. Mulroney. Proceeding with fines without a clear, legally defensible bylaw violation and after being formally advised of such by counsel could be construed as malicious prosecution and harassment. It could also open up the individual board members who vote for such an action to personal liability. Are you and the rest of the board prepared for that potential outcome and for the HOA to bear the considerable legal costs of defending such a weak case, not to mention Mr. Henderson's legal fees when you inevitably lose?" The mention of personal liability and wasted HOA funds on a losing battle seemed to hit home. Several residents gasped. Arthur blanched. Even Carol looked alarmed. Brenda stared at Tom, then at me, her face a mask of fury and dawning defeat. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, Brenda Mulroney was speechless. The vault door had not only secured my home, it had just checkmated the queen of petty tyranny. The aftermath of that HOA meeting was swift and decisive. Brenda Mulroney, stripped of her bluster and exposed as a bully, found her authority within the HOA crumbling. The motion to fine me or pursue legal action over the vault door was never even formally voted on. It died a quiet death amidst the uncomfortable silence that followed Tom's pronouncements. Within a month, facing a vote of no confidence and widespread disapproval from residents who were tired of her antics, Brenda resigned from the HOA board. She cited personal reasons, but everyone knew the truth. Her reign of beige terror was over. The remaining board members, humbled and perhaps a little wiser, quickly adopted a more conciliatory and common-sense approach to governance. The petty fines and nitpicking seemed to vanish overnight. A new president was elected, a retired librarian named Eleanor, who was more interested in community gardens and fixing the clubhouse roof than in dictating door aesthetics. My vault door, of course, remained. It became something of a local legend in Willow Creek. Neighbors would occasionally stop by ostensibly to chat, but really to get a closer look at it. Some were awed, some amused, but no one was hostile anymore. It was seen not as an act of defiance against the community, but as a symbol of one man's stand against bureaucratic overreach. It was a reminder that sometimes you have to go to extraordinary lengths to protect ordinary rights. Life in my condo returned to its previous peaceful rhythm, albeit with a much more secure front door. Patches, my cat, seemed to approve of the new arrangement. The steel door probably made him feel like he was living in a very exclusive, very safe feline kingdom. I went back to tinkering with my miniature steam engines, my mind no longer consumed with bylaws and battles. The greatest satisfaction for me wasn't just winning, it was the restoration of peace, the reclaiming of my sanctuary. It was knowing that I hadn't backed down when faced with injustice, however petty its initial form. And yes, I'll admit, every time I spun that big chrome handle and heard the satisfying clunk of the locking bolts, a little smile would touch my lips. It was a beautiful piece of engineering after all. I learned a few things from the whole ordeal. Firstly, never underestimate the lengths to which someone drunk on a little bit of power will go. Secondly, always read the fine print, whether it's an HOA bylaw or a contract. Knowledge is your best defense. Thirdly, sometimes the most effective solution to an unreasonable problem is an equally, spectacularly unreasonable but legally defensible response. And finally, that even in a quiet suburban condo complex, the spirit of "don't tread on me" can burn brightly. Occasionally, I'd see Brenda around the neighborhood, usually scurrying away if she saw me approaching. The pursed lips were still there, but the arrogant certainty in her eyes was gone, replaced by a look of perpetual, sour resentment. I never gloated, never said a word. The vault door said everything that needed to be said. It stood there, a silent, gleaming testament to the fact that one determined individual, armed with a bit of ingenuity and a strong sense of what's right, can indeed move mountains, or, in this case, install an 800-pound steel door and bring a petty tyrant to heel. And you know what? My little corner of Willow Creek felt a whole lot more harmonious after that. Maybe stainless steel really is a very agreeable aesthetic after all.